You guys know I always struggle with, well, you can turn me down. Can you hear me? I always struggle with what to do on Wednesday nights because I just like the process. You know, it doesn't really matter what Bible book we study. I just have fun doing it. And so I kind of have a log of all the Wednesday nights we've done in my almost 10 years here, and was looking for holes and things that we hadn't done. And I gathered those up and sent them to a couple of trusted advisors in this room. And they came back, of all things, with Judges. And I was like, what? Why did I even put that on the list? I was like, I don't want to do Judges. I don't like that book. And that stands to, but they were excited about Judges. And so I'm fine with it. I asked, I put it on the list. So Judges it is, but it remains, Judges is not one of my favorite books in the entire Bible. It's a weird book. It's a challenging book. It's a great narrative, and it's got some great literary qualities. We see a chiastic structure that we'll talk about in the beginning and the end. You've got different cyclical arrangements. I mean, the literary parts are great, and but man, is it violent and weird and just kind of sickening. And one of those people wrote back, yeah, but so is today, so it fits. Like, okay, fair enough. Another thing I don't like about Judges is not exactly a happy ending. It's not exactly a happy start either. We get kind of a sad start, and it gets worse, and it ends, and it really is a book that is a warning for all who read it. What is that warning? I don't think for us it's a nationalistic warning. I don't think we're some replacement Israel necessarily, but it does say something about the obedience of a people group in general and the corrupting nature of human leadership. I think we can learn, but personally, its obedience to God's ways is absolutely vital. And disobedience is always going to have consequences. And so we can learn that from it personally. We can learn that God's mercy and his faithfulness is absolutely, positively incredible. His love is truly unconditional. When we see these cycles that Israel goes through and we kind of see them reflected in our own lives, we can see God's mercy and his faithfulness to his promises continues to remain in our lives. And then I think ultimately, I'm working with a couple of young men, Everett and I, on preaching. And our lesson tonight is how every sermon points to Jesus. And every biblical book ultimately points to Jesus, that Jesus is the climax of the entire Bible. And I think Judges certainly points to that, with the repeated failures of these deliverers. It's a look forward to our ultimate deliverer that will pay that price for us. So it shows us we have a desperate need for God to provide us with that true deliverer. You guys like Judges? Or are you excited about Judges and ever study Judges? If any of you say yes, you're going to be up here next week. So keep that in mind. Oh yeah, I love Judges. Get up here. It's Gideon. Yeah, Gideon's a weird story. They're all weird stories. They're all weird stories. Well, let's start by putting the book in context, because I think this is very, very important. So let's zoom out just a little bit and put the book in the context. As you know, towards the end of Genesis, we read those the great stories of Joseph and what Joseph went through in Egypt, and how God used that suffering to deliver his family out of the famine and save them. They remained as a family in Egypt, and as we know, that kind of digressed into a very bad situation. They became slaves for 400 years in Egypt. God raises up Moses, that we read about in the book of Exodus, leads them out of bondage and into the promised land. Moses himself couldn't go in, but they after 40 years of wandering, they finally make it. The promised land was occupied by that time. And so God gave instructions through Moses on what to do when they arrived. This is where I want to start tonight, because Deuteronomy chapter 7 is vital to the understanding of the book of Judges. So let's look real quick at Deuteronomy 7. When the Lord your God, this is Moses telling Israel, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're entering to take possession of it and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. For they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But thus shall you deal with them. You shall break down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and chop down their asherim and burn their carved images with fire. What we see here is God telling the Israelites through Moses that when you come into this land, you've got to purify it of all other gods. This sounds incredibly violent to our modern ears and awful, and part of the same reason Judges does. It's like, wow, God seems harsh against them, and we see ultimately it is for His holiness, it's for the purity of their worship of Him. That's the ultimate drive, that's the ultimate motivation here. We can unpack that further as we continue to get into some of these more troubling passages of things that God tells them to do, but you see from the very beginning, God tells Moses, you've got to take care of this. I'm gonna drive these nations out, but you have to go all the way through with it. You've got to make sure it is gone. Verse 17, another warning. If you say in your heart, these nations are greater than I, how can I dispossess them? And what you saw there, Moses saying, hey, these 7 nations I just listed, they're all mightier than you. They're all bigger than you. They're all stronger than you. But don't be afraid. And he comes back to this idea. You shall not be afraid of them, but you shall remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt, the great trials that your eyes saw, the signs, the wonders, the mighty hand, and the outstretched arm by which the Lord your God brought you out. So will the Lord your God do to all the peoples of whom you are afraid. And so all of these guys were told to remember what God had done to Egypt, the mightiest land that they could possibly think of. Yes, these nations are stronger than Israel was at the time, but they're not as strong as Egypt. And so Moses is reminding them, when you get there and you feel that fear that we can't overtake them, they outnumber us, or their technology is better than us, don't be afraid by remembering what God has already done for you. Don't be afraid, because God delivered you from the hand of Pharaoh of Egypt. As mighty as they get, surely he can deliver you among these nations. And so after Moses' death, since he couldn't actually enter the promised land, God used Joshua to begin the conquest of the land that he had promised to the house of Israel. Throughout the book of Joshua, we read of these battles over the enemies of God with a continued eye on Deuteronomy 7. That's part of what Joshua was doing, was fulfilling these commands, trying to drive everybody out so that they could possess the land by themselves. There was a faithfulness to God to this idea. It wasn't perfect. You see some bumps throughout the book of Joshua, right? But the Israelites overcame their enemies in God's power, and they gained control of the promised land. Not everybody had been driven out yet, but Israel was now the dominant power within that area. The job wasn't completely finished, but Joshua had reached the end of his life, and he challenged the people of Israel to finish the job and maintain this covenant with God. Joshua 24:15 comes to mind. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, Joshua says, as he's passing on from his life and his leadership, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. A lot of you have that probably hanging in your house, as do I somewhere. And then verse 16, I love this. Keep this response in mind, okay, as we turn to the book of Judges. Then the people answered, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did these great signs in our sight, and preserved us in all the way that we went, and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God." So it's this point when we turn to the book of Judges. A lot of you know what's coming. This sentiment is going to slowly erode within Israel to the point where it's almost unrecognizable by the end of Judges. It's so far from God, and this idea that their ancestors had said before Joshua, "No, we will always keep the Lord in mind. We will always know what he did. We will continue to follow his commands. We will do what he has told us to do." The Israelites had gained control of the land, but the conquest was far from complete. And so Judges begins with an interesting double introduction, which is also interesting because it has a double conclusion as well. When we get there, it has kind of this, we're going to read an introduction, and then it's almost like it resets and we introduce again. And you'll see kind of the reasoning for that. Part one of the introduction concerns these direct commands from God, from Deuteronomy 7, that they were to cleanse the entire land, that they were to drive out all these other people groups. And whether or not they militarily overcame their enemies within their given lands. So everybody's kind of broken up into their areas, and this tribe is to go ahead and finish off that area. This tribe's to go ahead and finish off this area, and so on and so forth. So, any questions before we begin the book of Judges? We've set the scene. Are you ready for some nastiness? Yes, so ready for some action. That's right.
The book of Judges covers what, 3 centuries?
They're not sure. About 3 centuries is about right. 250, 350 years. Because it's not, as I'll say later, it's not necessarily chronological. It's just snippets of stories that were happening during this time.
Did the scholars think Joshua could have been the author?
I didn't see anybody say that. Yeah, I don't think, I didn't read anybody. No, they just don't know the author. I don't think it was. I would hesitate to say Joshua. That seems, yeah. It could be Samuel. Yep, that's probably the leading candidate. All right, Judges chapter 1. After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" The Lord said, "Judah shall go up. Behold," he's talking about the tribe here, not the person. "Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand." And Judah said to Simeon, his brother, "Come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I likewise will go with you into the territory allotted to you." So Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand. And they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek at Bezek and fought against him and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. So interestingly enough, just a quick aside there, a pagan king recognizes he's kind of getting what came to him. He got what he deserved. He said, "I've done this to others, and now it has been done to me." Verse 8, "And the men of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. And afterward the men of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country, in the Negeb, and in the lowland. And Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba. And they defeated Sheshai and Ahaman and Talmai." A lot of good kids' names in here if your grandkids are looking for. We go on now, and I'll break this down here in a second, but we're hearing of the stories of Judah, the tribe of Judah. Judah asks the tribe of Simeon for help. Hey, let's do this together. You come help me, and I'll come help you. Then we get a specific story of Caleb, a hero from the days of Joshua. You remember he was the fellow spy with Joshua that said, hey, yeah, we can take this promised land. Verse 11, from there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kiriath Sephir. And Caleb said, he who attacks Kiriath Sephir and captures it, I will give him Aksah, my daughter, for a wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it. And he gave him Aksah, his daughter, for a wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you want? She said to him, give me a blessing. Since you have set me in the land of the Negev, give me also springs of water. And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. Caleb here is used as a faithful example of somebody who did what he was supposed to be doing, went and took care of his area and kept the intermarrying within that family, right? He did not marry the people of the land. He got rid of the people of the land. And as a result, you see Caleb has good fortunes, good results, good consequences fall upon him and his family. Verse 16, and the descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negeb near Arad. And they went and settled with the people. And Judah went with Simeon, his brother, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephathah and devoted it to destruction. So the name of the city was called Hormah, which in Hebrew would be complete destruction. So again, doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? Judah also captured Gaza with its territory and Ashkelon, both huge Philistine cities with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. And Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses said, and he drove out from it the three sons of Anak. All right, so lots of stories there from the tribe of Judah, and we just get a bunch of quick narratives, and I would call them kind of a mixed story from Judah and Simeon. Overall, it reads as a success, right, for the most part, especially when we get to the rest of them, but that's for later. Right now, we're just looking at what Judah did. For the most part, we have Caleb and his family remaining faithful and trusting in God, seeing success as a result, following those commandments that they have been given, doing it the way God told them to do it, and as a result, getting what God said that they would get. And so there was kind of a cause and effect there for Caleb. The rest of the tribe fared pretty well. Yes, they asked for help. Instead of trusting in the Lord, they asked for Simeon's help. And some scholars said that was, why did they do that? They didn't need that help. They should have trusted God. But God remained with them. And no, they couldn't drive out the people of the plain. Why? Because they had iron chariots. Their technology was a little stronger. And so they stopped a little bit short. They should have realized, right, that God could have overcome that, right? I mean, had they seen him overcome chariots before? Absolutely they had. All the way back to Egypt. He'd seen them take out the technology of the day, and God used God's technology, the water, to just wash them out. They had seen this happen, but they became satisfied with their accomplishments, and Judah stopped right there. What kind of grade do you guys want to give Judah here? I thought somewhere in the B plus territory. Does that sound fair? I mean, they did most of what God told them to do. They stopped short in a couple of different places. Other examples of mid-range success follow the tribe of Benjamin. Remember that Judah had attacked Jerusalem. It wasn't an Israelite city yet. This is not like their home base. They're trying to take Jerusalem. They had attacked it, set it on fire, but Benjamin didn't finish the job. Look at verse 21. But the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. You're going to see that theme repeat, that they're starting to live and intertwine. How about the tribes of Joseph's family? They're mentioned again later, Manasseh and Ephraim, but here working together. Verse 22, the house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph scouted out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Please show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you." And he showed them the way into the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and called its name Luz. That is its name to this day. What did they do wrong there? Let one go. Again, this is just a little bit creeping in. To us, that sounds like a pretty good strategy. They found a way into a back way into the city, but is that what God told them to do? No. They kind of crafted their own plan. They followed their own scheme. They had success, but not the way God told them to do it. And as a result, I mean, they took the city, but they did so by striking a deal instead of trusting the Lord. And as a result, they the family gave birth to another Canaanite city, Luz. Rather than driving them out of the land, here's another city that now is on the edge of their territory. So, I mean, it's up to you. What do you want to give Benjamin and the tribes of Joseph? I don't know, maybe a little lower, maybe a C or so. Well, it gets a lot worse. Other tribes have worse success. Verse 27, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not drive them out completely. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. So the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Naholo. So the Canaanites lived among them, but became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or Alab, or Akzib, or Helba, or of Aphik, or Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath. So they lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath became subject to forced labor for them. So did you notice a repeated refrain in there that I told you to listen for? What happened? They lived among them. What was the command all the way back in Deuteronomy 7? Do not live among them. Period. Do not intermarry. This is what's going to happen. If you do this, this is what's going to happen. You can't, when you come into the land, get rid of them completely, or else negative consequences are coming. They often did not overcome their enemies because they either perceived they were too strong. I think that's probably some of the time they said, well, they're too strong. Let's just leave them there, and we'll deal with them later. Clearly they were stronger than them, right? Or sometimes another good military strategy, if you come upon a people that you could completely annihilate, why annihilate them? Have them do your work for you. Bring them as slaves and cause them to be forced labor. And so you see that a lot too. They left cities and people groups who they said, they might be too strong. Maybe we lose that battle. And others, well, these are clearly weak. Let's just make them work our fields. Let's just make them. Did God instruct them to do either of those? No. Yes, exactly. God said these places are mightier than you, and I'm still mightier than them. That's a good point, Peggy. He pointed that out.
Human nature there to think, well, I know what God told us, but slaves are going to help us, and God's with us. So
yeah. Well, a lot of this, and you start to see our own tendencies even already of just assuming grace, assuming mercy, assuming forgiveness, assuming that God is going to be with us, and just kind of letting the little things go here and there. All right, so let's give that whole mess a D. I'm feeling friendly because I got to save the F for Dan. Sorry, Dan. You're named Daniel, right? Yeah, well, you're not named after the tribe of Dan. You're named after the hero Daniel, yes. Verse 34. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites persisted in dwelling on Mount Heres in Ajalon and in Sha'alabim. But the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. And so the Amorites seem to have defeated the tribe of Dan enough now that Ephraim and Manasseh put them into forced labor. They were stronger than them, but Dan could not overcome them. And so much so that they're the only foreign nation on this list that has a border actually defined. And so they've defined their border, and they've said, hey, we're just going to have to live with these guys. Dan did. And so I'm giving Dan an F. So the tribes have not done very well. And all of this, God was not pleased at all. They had broken the command of Deuteronomy 7 of when they first came into the land. They had broken that covenant renewal that Joshua did with them and said, hey, as for you and your house, you choose who you're going to serve, but we're going to serve the Lord. And the people go, oh, we'll never forget God. We'll do as he's commanded. We will worship him always. And so as we turn to chapter 2, a manifestation of God himself or God's messenger, an angel, appears to rebuke Israel for this very disobedience. Look at verse 1 of chapter 2. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. And they called the name of that place Bochim. And they sacrificed there to the Lord. Interestingly enough, Bochim means weepers, a bunch of crying people. They named the city after that because of their apparent repentance, but as you guys know, it's going to not, stick. And so we see the concern here was not a military victory, was it? That was never God's concern. Hey, drive away these people because I hate this people. No, it wasn't that. God was saying, if you don't do this, you're going to have ongoing spiritual purity issues. The nation is going to continue to struggle. And I love that line, their gods shall be a snare to you. And I wonder, fast forwarding to our day, how often can we say that? When we intermingle, when we continue to let little things slide, how often are their gods a snare to us? I think that happens often in our day, whether that's entertainment options, political parties, whatever the case may be, food and drink, whatever it may be, our materialism. There are so many gods in the land that we are currently foreigners in, that when we intermingle like that, their gods become a snare to us. It's an incredible warning. God rebuked them for their lack of faith in him and tells them of the consequences of their partial obedience. Everybody with the exception of Dan, I gave, a passing grade, but did any of them really pass? No, not even Judah. Because what we're finding out and what we'll continue to find out in the book of Judges is partial obedience equals disobedience. God, only obeying God in a portion of what he's told you to do is disobedience, right? It's failure. Before we transition to the other repetition of this double introduction, anything you'd want to bring out so far? Mm-hmm. It only gets worse. Yeah. They're still dealing with this, aren't they? Yeah. Yep.
That's the reason why the tribe of Dan is no longer in the
Why you don't see them?
list of tribes in Revelation.
A lot of people have pointed out that fact, that, yeah.
Ashkelon's right down in with Gaza area.
Mm-hmm.
What they're fighting right now.
Yeah, you definitely see modern consequences, don't you? So now we transition into, like I said, kind of this double introduction. So it's going to feel like a little bit of a repetition here. And instead of it focusing on what they did and didn't do, the military side of it, we're now going to see the spiritual side of it. That's kind of that transition that the angel of the Lord was saying, hey, as a result of this, their gods are going to be a snare to you. So we're going to see the implications of what they haven't done. And so the focus isn't on the military victory, it's on the spiritual idolatry that stems from their failure to eliminate the worship of these other gods. And so we start by overlapping the story from back in Joshua 24, verse 6 of chapter 2. When Joshua dismissed the people of Israel went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. And they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres and the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gash. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. In other words, they died off. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. So we see, again, like I said, this is a double introduction. So this is the second part of that. We're kind of repeating what we've already said that was focused on military victories, but we now see it from a different lens of part of the issue here was these tribes were going out to complete all these victories that the previous generation had started, and they had forgotten who God was. They had forgotten God. They had forgotten what he had done for Israel. And as a result, they began to do exactly what God warned them would happen. They're going to start to drift. They're going to continue to drift. Even before I go on, I think that, let me, just a quick aside, this is why an intergenerational church is important to me. Because I think this is so important to continue to beat that drum for following generations. It's not teaching them all the different little habits that we have or the traditions we have. It's teaching them who God is, what he's done for us, and why the gospel matters to their generation. And I think continuing to repeat that is so vital because you see one generation is all it takes. One generation of slippage is all it takes. And then we end up where the book of Judges is. Verse 11, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. One generation. Just one generation beyond that. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. And so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hand of the surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. So what is God doing here? Exactly what he said would happen. Exactly what he said they would do, and exactly what he said he would do as a result. As a result of them turning their backs on God and worshiping these idols from these other lands, God is going to use those very nations to oppress them. They didn't drive them out, and so God says, okay, you don't get rid of this out of your life. I'm now going to turn around and use it to discipline you, to punish you. It's an interesting little application there, isn't it? When we don't get rid of stuff in our life, it usually is what then comes back and teaches us to rely and trust on God more. It's weird how God uses that. And it's not that we should let those things go so that we can later learn a lesson and trust. Just trust in the beginning. And then you don't have to go through that lesson, right? And so God is using the very nations they failed to drive out to oppress his own people. Israel was distressed as a result, and God said he will keep his covenant. And so what is he going to do as he releases and he allows this oppression? Even in the midst of this, God raises up what we call judges. It's where we get the name of the book. Now, don't think, these guys standing in black courtroom robes with gavels and ready to go. It's not a legal type of judge at all. In fact, probably not the best English translation, but it's the one we have and it's one we're sticking with. A better one might be deliverers. And you'll hear it repeated, even that word used a couple of times. He's raising up basically people who would lead a deliverance of his people. Verse 16, let's read about them. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly. So he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. So there you just see a little snippet that God knew what was going to happen all along, right? He knew their disobedience was coming. He knew what he was going to use these nations for. And so here in this passage, we are introduced into what we can call the cycle of the judges, the cycle that we're going to see throughout this book. We're going to see it again and again and again and again and again and one more time after that. It's almost repeated verbatim. Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord by what? What do they do? What is the evil? What? Following other gods. Again, you go back to why did God want them to drive these people out? Is it because he hated these people? Is it because those people didn't have worth or value? No, it's because it would lead his people to turn from him. It would lead them to worship other gods, worship other idols, and that's exactly what happened. So Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord. Step 2 is always the Lord allows them to be oppressed as a result. The anger of the Lord burns against them, and he says, okay, Amorites, okay, Philistines, you take whatever people group that they failed to drive out, and God's going to use them to oppress his own people. What happens with Israel once that happens? Once oppression hits and they're buckled down there, they've become slaves again, or they're being abused, they cry out to God. Amazing how pain can drive us to repentance, huh? And oh God, we failed you. Forgive us, please. They cry out to the Lord. And so what does God do? He raises up a judge, a deliverer from in their midst. And then the oppression is subdued as a result of the actions of that judge. And as a result of that, Israel lives at peace. And what happens when there's peace? Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord. They become comfortable. They become complacent. They become apathetic. And again, you see the pattern in our own lives here, don't you? We become complacent. We become apathetic because God is so good. God is so faithful, and I can count completely on him, so I'm just going to do what I want to do. Oh, here we go. Now I'm in trouble. God, please save me. God says, okay, you've learned the lesson this time. I'll save you. The oppression is subdued, and we're at peace again, and everything is comfortable, and so we start the cycle again. It's maddening. It really, really is. And so we're going to see this cycle multiple times through the book. In fact, there's what we're going to call major cycles and minor cycles. Couple things as we go through this book. It is not meant to be exhaustive in geography or chronology. It's not necessarily okay, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, or is it covering all of Israel? This kind of stuff was happening all over the place. This is a sampling of stories from this era of the judges that were going on all over the place. I look forward, this is one of those things in heaven. I think we can go to the library and let's see who these other judges were, the ones that didn't make the cut into the book. And we'll see, I think it's 6 minor judges and 6 major judges. The minor ones, we don't really even get a story from. They're just barely mentioned. But the major ones, the ones that you guys really know the names of, you've already mentioned a few of them tonight, those are the ones we'll hear a full story on. But most of these stories are localized and they're representative of what was happening in Israel in general at the time. And cycles is not really the best word, even though it is very cyclical. It also has a trajectory. Which way? Downward. And so really, Judges is not just cycles, it's a downward spiral. Because as we continue to go on, it gets progressively worse. Not only does Israel's evil get worse, and you see their apathy, by the last judge, they're not even turning back to God. They make it to step 2. And that's pretty much it. That just not only does evil get worse in Israel, the deliverers themselves, the judges themselves, become less and less godly to the point that we're left saying, why is God using this person? What is God, was there nobody better to choose? Why, Samson, really? It doesn't make sense. And that's kind of the point, to let us see what happens when the people of God turn away from him and his ways and instead look to the cultures around them that they have intermingled with. I mean, to the point I made earlier, as much as I hate the book of Judges, boy, it does have its relevance for today, doesn't it? As we continue to syncretize our Christian faith and we take a little bit of this from our culture and a little bit of this from our culture, and we think, oh, those things aren't, it's just a little poison. I can handle it. I can stomach it. But it echoes into further generations and creates incredible problems like idolatry. So next week, we'll jump into chapter 3, do a little bit of that summary statement, and we'll meet our first couple of judges, Othniel, who you already heard of, and then Ehud, which is a fantastic story to tell to junior high boys. but it's weird for us. But any comments before I hit a couple of so whats? I think that's that pattern.
I think that pattern.
Oh, 100%. Yep.
Is there, then they forget totally about it.
Yep.
But in our lives as Christians, I think that can be there too. But the beauty of it is the Holy Spirit is still showing us.
Yeah.
This is where you're wrong. You need to repent.
Yep.
Change this.
And I do think, I think, and one of my so whats will be Jesus, of course. But I think that's where Jesus changing our heart changes that trajectory. I think we still have those cycles, but they can become cycles of growth all of a sudden. I got myself into this again, but now I'm going to cry out to the Lord, and he's going to change my heart, and I'm going to actually grow as a result. I mean, how many friends and family have you seen in this downward trajectory? That they get into trouble, they cry out to the Lord saves them, and they go right back to where they were. And it's just continuing to go downward and downward and downward. It's a picture of the human condition apart from Christ. That's why ultimately this book points to our need for him. Not any one of these judges, but the ultimate deliverer. Any other, Mike?
Yeah, just looking back on this, it's like 3,500 years ago. The two main gods they talk about are Baal and Ashtoreth.
Mm-hmm.
Baal is about children sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Ashtoreth is about sexual
Mm-hmm.
abuse. And Satan
Yeah.
kind of majors on that. And here we are today. We got the exact same type of culture.
Same kind of culture, yep.
If you get involved in bad sex, you end up pregnant. So what do? You offer your child
Yeah.
as a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. You're right. right, not far away from, there must be themes within the human heart of, yeah, I don't want to deal with the consequences of my actions. Yeah. Here's a few so what's I listed. Feel free to add some. Obedience to God's ways is vital. Disobedience has grave consequences. Kind of a no-brainer there. We all know that. Partial obedience, I said this earlier, is disobedience. You can't partly obey God. There is no B. It's either 100% or 0%. Even a little idolatry is so very dangerous. And I think that's what God is warning, and that's the pattern we're going to see, that even just it creeping in a little bit it's not just a little bit of poison. It's something that's going to take over. God's mercy and faithfulness is incredible. I said that earlier. I think you're going to see that throughout Judges, that why didn't God just bring a flood again? By halfway through Judges, I'm like, okay, bring on Noah. It's like, oh wait, he was messed up too. It's amazing to see this as a story also of God's mercy and faithfulness. And then finally, we have a desperate need for God to provide us with a true deliverer. And that is what ultimately Judges points to, is we have this cycle in our heart. And without Christ, we are caught on that downward spiral. With Christ, I think I would argue part of sanctification is continuing to go through this cycle, but I think God changes the trajectory in our hearts. And I think we actually can look back and see growth. And we can say, you know what? I went around that, but this time I did it differently. And I trusted God in this step, but I forgot this part. And so now I'm going to grow in that next time. And we continue in an upward trajectory that we would call sanctification, once Jesus has changed our heart. Any so what's that you would add? Yeah, God's mercy, faithfulness, long-suffering, chesed is what the Old Testament word that we always see within Psalms. It's that undefinable English word that has all those things wrapped up in it. Long-suffering, patience that God has, His mercy, His faithfulness, His love for us that is steady regardless of what happens. Did I ever tell you guys I had an Old Testament professor that was his license plate? Chesed, Hessed. Tell, okay, that's an Old Testament professor. That's yes, God doesn't. It's His covenant, and just because we don't keep up ours doesn't mean He lets go of His, which is, again, His faithfulness is amazing. All right, let's pray. God, thank you for bringing us together today in a book I really don't care for. But I recognize it has incredible value, and it does have has patterns, it has applications, it has principles. It has things that we can learn for today. God, we can see them even in our own hearts. And may that be what this is, not just a history lesson, but a opportunity for personal application. As we study all of these terrible stories, we see our propensity for sin apart from Jesus Christ changing our hearts. God, that this is, what we read here is the story of the human condition. We turn to you for help, you help us, and then we turn our backs on you. And so God, I pray that we would learn from this, and I pray that even as we might continue even occasionally to cycle through, we would be in an upward trajectory, learning from our mistakes as you're patient and you're kind and you're faithful and you're long-suffering with us. Because we know, God, the ultimate deliverer is Jesus Christ. The ultimate judge is Jesus Himself. And as we've given our hearts over to Him, I pray that we would not complete these cycles, but look to our King. And it's in His name we pray these things. And amen. All right, see you back next week. Except for the Coopers.